Good morning. Just a warm welcome to everybody, and especially those of you who are visiting St. Paul's for the first time. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So when we hear the gospel lesson, like the one today being read in the church, it's kind of easy to think that the Pharisees and the scribes are antagonists and opponents to Jesus. And Jesus has, as you probably are very well aware, has a lot of harsh things to say to this group of religious leaders. But when we look a little bit more closely to the Gospels, the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees and the scribes it's actually pretty complex. First of all, for a group of people that he seems to really like to bash on, they're kind of always in the audience. Isn't that weird? They keep on coming to listen to him. And, they invite Jesus into their homes for meals. They appear to warn Jesus when he's in danger. And there are Pharisees and scribes whom Jesus praises. So, and once again, in today's reading, they're right there among the people who came to listen to him. And we hear that they start grumbling when they see Jesus eating with, tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus decides to tell them a parable, or several parables. And we get the first two. The last third parable is actually the very famous parable of the prodigal son, which we don't get to hear this time around. And I think when I read these parables, what comes through them in Jesus's communication to the Pharisees and the scribes is a sense of care. He's really trying to reach out to them and touch them. And he's not really trying to castigate them. And the Pharisees and the scribes had some pretty valid grounds, I think, for grumbling. When the gospel says tax collectors and sinners, it's probably not talking about economically poor and marginalized people. Most likely, these people who are labeled as tax collectors and sinners, tax collectors, it's obvious, they're colluding with the Roman government in many cases. The sinners would have been people who have turned their backs on the community and living a life that causes some kind of harm to the larger community. So, when Jesus is hanging out with them, it probably raised eyebrows, on many faces, not just the Pharisees and the scribes. And so instead of castigating his frenemies, the Pharisees and scribes, he decides to tell them parables about being lost. So why tell stories instead of just giving a straightforward theological explanation? First, that would be too boring. And as Dorothy Sayers reminds us, Jesus never bored a single soul in his life, unlike professional Christians like myself. And because, too, stories go beyond rational thinking, and they evoke imagination and feelings. They also tug at our empathy bone, They provoke us to identify with a character or a set of characters in this greater drama in which we find ourselves. And we have the invitation and the opportunity to see ourselves differently through the story and to see other people differently through their stories. So we get to the parable of the lost sheep. When Jesus tells this parable, the Pharisees and the scribes suddenly find themselves in the position of a person who has lost something of value. And immediately they're pulled in to feeling not distance from sinners and tax collectors, but concern. Because the message is, there's no inside and outside here. We're all just one flock. The sinners are cast as part of the same flock. And that gives them equal value and status as everyone else. And when people in Jesus' context heard shepherd and sheep, this is a familiar trope in the tradition, right? Where the sheep are compared to the people, God's people, and the shepherd represents both God and often leaders, religious leaders and political leaders in Israel. So they would have understood who fits which part in this story. And as people likened to sheep, Jesus' main audience, the Pharisees and the scribes, they're compelled to reimagine the tax collectors as sinners, as people who have somehow lost themselves along the way and not inherently bad people, right? And that's a significant difference. People who probably have done some really bad things and maybe continue to do bad things because a lot of them might not be able to help themselves. But the story is inviting us to consider them as people who lost their way, not intrinsically evil people that we have the right to unilaterally judge because maybe their lives are complex and all kinds of conditions could have contributed to them going in the direction that they probably didn't want to go in the first place. And leaving the 99, I'm skipping ahead of myself. The shepherd in the parable obviously stands for God, but it also stands for the religious leaders. And the shepherd models care and loyalty to the flock, especially when members of the flock are in danger. And leaving the 99 in the wilderness here does not mean abandonment. There's probably an assumption that they would have been left in an enclosure where they're safe, or left with another shepherd who would have watched over them. The point is that they're safe and counted for. The ones who are lost, they're in danger. And that demands some kind of moral feeling, some kind of moral response that's empathetic and compassionate. So the impact of the parable is not to guilt the Pharisees and the scribes into changing their attitude. It's actually to soften their hearts, right? To soften the sense of being apart from these people that they find so objectionable for probably very good reasons, right? And to consider the reality from a little bit of a more spacious standpoint. If I could just make a little bit of an aside. Religion, especially Christianity, gets associated so often with guilt. Is that your experience? Yes. So, I had an experience where I was walking down the street and I was at a crosswalk, and there was a police officer kind of monitoring the area because there was construction going on, and the light had turned, to the white walking figure, I guess you would say. So we were supposed to walk, but they stopped us from going because there was something going on. And this woman, an older woman who was standing in front of me, right in front of the walkway, turns to me and says, "I'm sorry." And I said, "Why are you telling me you're sorry?" And she said, "Because I was cursing." And I was like, "Okay, do I have my collar on?" Okay, yeah. Yeah, I did have my collar on, and that's why she was turning to me and saying she was sorry. And I was walking, I said, "That you don't have any reason to be sorry to me, I understand, that's fine." And I was walking down the road, and I stopped at a cafe, and I saw a parishioner that I hadn't seen in a long time. And I was like, hey Dawn, how's it going? Great to see you. And the first thing she says to me is, "I'm really sorry, I haven't been to church." I'm like, is this like a guilt-inducing machine or something? I'm like, what? Why are you? Why is the first word you say to me when I see you is "I'm sorry"? That's really distressing. And religion is not about, I think, in its truest sense, it's not about feeling guilt. It's about liberation. Whether you're in church or not, I care, but I don't care that much. Okay, if it's something that you want to come to, that's great. If it's not, that's great too. What meets your needs? That's what's important. So it's not about guilt; it's about liberation. And for Jesus, in this instance at least, he takes a tack where he's trying to soften the hearts of his audience, his peers, his Pharisee and scribe brothers. But because the audience of the parables is so clearly identified as this group of religious leaders, I wonder if it can be easy to overlook the question that the parables throw at us today. The question seems to me to be, how often do you, Won-Jae, Distinguish yourself from others when you go into a room and see a bunch of people. How often do you go into a room and you're saying to yourself, subconsciously or consciously, I'm not like that person, or that person, or that person. I'm different from them. How often does that happen? It happens a lot. And Jesus is also pointing out through this parable, and in a lot of his interactions with the Pharisaic group, again, his peers and his frenemies, not his enemies, but his frenemies, that a lot of people who commit to walking a spiritual path, they can actually go awry if that spiritual path becomes another means to elevate and reinforce their sense of self-centered ego. Okay, how many Christians, how many externally religiously devout persons have we come across who use their religiosity to actually cover up their insecurity and to feel superior and different from other people? I've seen this in conservative and progressive Christian communities. And I have fallen into that trap myself, and I've been guilty of that too. But it happens often, happens a lot. How faith, something that's supposed to help us to get in touch with the truth, our own truth and the truth of God, and help us to blossom as people of love, how that very thing can become a mask that we use to hide from ourselves and to hide from our wounds and the difficult truths that we have to face if we genuinely want to live in freedom internally. The consequences of whether we can hold fast to our commitment to God without falling into a dualistic mindset that divides the world between me and them, us and them, that the consequences can be serious. Jesus directs the message to his Pharisaic brothers and sisters, but he's also reaching out to speak to us in our own time. And as he responded to them with care for their authenticity and their genuine liberation from all pretense, he speaks to us with the same care, asking us to examine our own self-perception and attitudes toward others, especially those who strike us as so different from us that we can't imagine them to be anything like us whatsoever, especially when we meet people like that. We're asked to reconsider our perception, touch our shared community, our shared humanity, I mean. And I think this leads us to the final point, at least the way I read it, of the parable. The invitation is not just to stop judging other people and to be inclusive. Just like the parable of the prodigal son, the invitation is to become like the shepherd, to be loving like the shepherd who seeks out those who have lost their way, instead of being so quick to judge them and dismiss them as those people are like this, X, Y, and Z. And why is that? And this is my own conviction. I don't think Christian ethics, if you want to call it that, is about doing good because that's what's expected of us. I mean, there might be something to that, sure. But the ultimate grounds for doing good has to do with who we are. This is about our deepest identity. And who we are, the Gospels seem to say to us, and the whole Scriptures seem to say to us, who we are is, we are in some real sense divine. If we say we're God's children, that means in our deepest core, there dwells a divine presence, an inviolable, right, undefeatable, ever-loving, ever-spacious, infinitely powerful divine presence. That's who we are. And we're asked to be that, to live as that, to bear God's image and to carry that light in the world.